Welcome to Forest Alchemy. Love, land, and community in a dance of wild creativity.
We're Mike and Forest dwellers and soul partners, sharing stories and projects from our permaculture community homestead. Come gather by the fire. Let's explore the magic of connection and the living land. All right, welcome. It's episode 8. We're with Elspeth Hay.
Yeah, Elspeth is a writer and the creator and host of the Local Food Report, a weekly feature that has aired on Cape Cod's NPR station since 2008. Deeply immersed in her own local food system, she writes and reports for print, radio, and online media with a focus on food, the environment, and the people, places, and ideas that feed us. She lives in Wellfleet, Massachusetts, and we just finished her book,
Feed Us with Trees.
Feed Us with Trees. We finished it 2 days ago, and it was an amazing book. We really enjoyed it. So we're excited to be talking with you here today.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, when the book was sent to us, I was like, oh, this sounds interesting. Like, we're gonna learn more about like growing trees and eating from trees. But then as more and more I read, I'm like, oh my gosh, it's about history, like indigenous history, Euro-American history. It's about commons. It's about acorns. It's about like, there were just so many things that just like kept going, and we just loved it.
Yeah, you covered so many topics around it, and so it was really good, and it brought a lot of new information to us that we didn't know.
Mm-hmm.
We've actually, funny enough, we've got a friend here who started this group called Montague Commoners.
Oh.
And they do like a community maple boil. They like go tap trees around town and like have people bring sap and they boil it together. And then they share they share the syrup, and then they also have acorn harvesting. And like we've gone and helped with that, or I've gone and helped with that in the past. And
and they make acorn pancakes.
Yeah, and they make acorn pancakes, and I'm like, well, this tastes good, but it seems like a lot of work to make pancakes. So I wasn't quite as excited about it. And then we read your book, and we're way more excited about acorns now. We went out last night, probably like a half hour before sunset. Well, before that, we went out in our woods, and we've got a lot of oak trees in our woods, but the acorns are pretty tiny. So I remembered a park up the road that has that I've seen bigger acorns, so we went up there, and most of our time there was in the dark with flashlights just collecting some acorns.
Yeah.
Do you know if you're collecting from red oak family or white oak?
I think it was red oak.
Yeah. Those tend to be leaves. Bigger, so that's good.
Well, they look like they were, actually we brought some, but there's these little ones from our house, but they both looked like they were red oak, but then these big ones were from what looked like red oak too.
Yeah, we've got a mix of red and white oak.
Yeah, the way you'll be able to tell as the weeks go on is that the white oak acorns sprout in the fall. So almost as soon as they fall, they try to put down a taproot and start growing. And the red oak family, they wait until spring. So if you hold on to some of them for a few weeks without trying to dry them or freeze them or do any kind of intervention, then the white oak ones will start sprouting, and then you'll know.
Yeah.
Okay.
Do we need, like, is it okay if we leave them in a bucket, or do we need to like flatten them out so they don't mold?
I would
I,
flatten them out just like by, I mean, people say buy a wood stove, but like, I don't know about where you are. I'm not using a wood stove right now. It's quite warm
not
Not
out.
yet.
yet. Yeah.
So I sometimes put them in a dehydrator. If I'm really busy, I just like put them in a trash bag and throw them in my chest freezer until I can deal with them.
Ah, yeah. Uh-huh.
But even just if you spread them out on like a cookie sheet and put them out in the sun with something over them, like sometimes I'll use a window screen or we have these sort of square boxes that my husband's built for doing clam bakes that has like hardware cloth and then
Okay.
like
Yeah.
a not a two by four, like a one by two or something around the edge, because otherwise you will have a squirrel party wherever you're trying to drive them out
I
very
mean,
quickly.
honestly, we have a squirrel party wherever we go because we call
Yeah,
ourselves the
we call
squirrel's
ourselves the
nest.
squirrels.
Well, then maybe you want that. But if you want to hold on to the acorns, you have to protect them because they are a hot commodity.
Sure.
Well, we could probably even put them. We've got a pretty big dehydrator, and we could probably just put them on the trays and put them in there, like just store them in there, even when we're
Mm-hmm.
not like using it to dry stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah, and even if you just did that, I dried them a little bit, like you'll interrupt that sprouting. So,
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, I think so far my favorite part about collecting the acorns was, like, we're home, we grow food and we like to forage too, and we're also very busy. We've got a lot of kids. So we'll go out and we'll harvest this like huge abundant thing, and then we have to immediately deal with it.
yeah,
And acorns aren't like that. You can like you said in the book, it can go like 10, 20 years before you
they're
have to
still
like
hanging
actually
out.
process them. Yeah, it's great.
It is great, and they're so forgiving. I think all my favorite categories of foods are now that forgiving category, like acorns and sourdough and kimchi and like
Mm.
these
Mhm.
alive but preserved,
Mhm.
self-preserving foods are really great for when life gets a little overwhelming.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, we make a lot of Mike introduced me to a recipe that he does, which he calls crouchy, and it's a mix
Hmm.
between kimchi and sauerkraut with red cabbage, but then like the like
Yeah,
curry seasoning. Oh, so
The
good.
red pepper flakes. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, we do a lot of fermenting.
I love that. There are some fermented acorn dishes that people have introduced me to. So, yeah, as I was talking to different
Ooh.
people from different backgrounds about what they're doing with acorns, I met a really amazing woman in Maine who unfortunately has since passed away. But she was making a fermented acorn cheese, like a vegan cheese type thing
Oh.
Ooh,
with ground
yeah. That
acorns.
makes sense.
Yeah, and I think that some of her recipes have been preserved by a friend, so I can see if I can track that down and send it to
Oh,
you.
that'd be
Wow.
fun. Yeah, I wonder if that's something Pascal
That's what I was
Boudoir
gonna.
does.
Yeah. Have you ever
Oh, yes.
Pascal? Yeah.
I
Yeah.
I don't know about that particular one, but yeah, that wouldn't surprise me.
Yeah. I always say that he's like his pictures, when I come across them, they're just like the sexiest ferments I've ever seen. They're
They
just
are
gorgeous.
beautiful. They're really beautiful.
So you talked a lot about the the no farms, no food slogan that goes around, and like we see that bumper sticker pretty regularly because our neighbor, who's a permaculture teacher, has it on his truck, and like most of their property is trees, like they've got an orchard and they've got some chestnuts and hazels,
Mostly food forest,
mostly
yeah.
food forest, yeah, and but then they do have the annual gardens, but they like that's primarily like what they sell is like stuff out of, well, I guess they do sell blackberries, but like stuff out of the annual garden. And like I've never thought of, like I drive around here in Michigan, this was all forest. Now we drive around so much of it and it's farmland, and that just makes me so sad that all the trees that were here are gone. But like I never thought of them, like how much food came from them
Mhm. Yeah.
Yeah.
before.
Yeah, I hadn't really thought about that either. I mean, I'd always grown up with the idea that we needed to clear farm fields in order to feed ourselves, and that
Mhm.
that really was the most efficient way to produce food and the most, productive per acre. And as populations grow, that was just something that we have to do. Like, we cannot be hunter gatherers because that's a completely different way of life than farming, and it's just not as productive. And I wasn't expecting, as I first started getting interested in acorns and acorn eating and nut trees in general, that idea would be so completely shattered in the process.
Mm-hmm.
I got a really wonderful email the other day from a reader who said, I loved your book. And also, like, are you saying we should never eat grains again? Because I think that they're really great. And I actually haven't written her back yet. I need to. But no, that's not, it's like, it's more just that that's not the only way to do things,
Mm-hmm.
and that this idea that we have to grow grains in these monocultures to feed ourselves because it's more productive is just such a lie.
Mm-hmm.
um,
Yeah.
that it doesn't make me want to never eat grains again, but it does mean that there's so much else to explore, and that we can create a balance on the landscape of trees and annual crops, and it doesn't have to be one or the other. And it doesn't have to be clearing to the extent that, our watersheds are suffering and the nitrogen cycle gets out of whack and the carbon
Yeah.
cycle
Mm-hmm.
gets out of whack. There's,
Yeah.
any in any ecosystem, you're going to have annual plants and you're going to have perennial plants, and there's room for all of those.
Mm-hmm.
And we have skewed so far in one direction that even like our mythology, this idea that food can only come from those fields, has
Mm-hmm.
completely erased this other way of eating. And so one of my goals with the book was to really bring trees back to the forefront and remind people that for most of human history, they have been right there alongside grains or in front of grains as a primary food source, not just for humans, but also for other species that we depend on as part of our food system. So yeah,
Mm-hmm.
it's interesting seeing those bumper stickers, because I it's true on the one hand and also so not true. So there's a lot to unpack when it comes to that story.
Yeah. No farms, less food.
Yeah.
Or like
Or
different food,
different
or
food.
Yeah. Yeah.
like, and maybe we want a lot of that farm food still. Like, I love tomatoes, I love
Yeah.
broccoli. Like, there's lots of things I want that come from a farm field. And we can be honest that that's not the only food.
Well,
Well,
and last
and go ahead.
Well, I was going to say last night when we were at the nature preserve harvesting acorns, there was a couple there that was walking their dog late at night as we're picking up acorns, and they're like we didn't know you could eat those. We didn't bring our other
Yeah.
dog because when he comes here he just eats the acorns.
Yeah.
I'm like, you could save on dog food.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I
Yeah.
didn't have any idea until about 5 or 6 years ago. A friend, and like, I'm a reporter, I report on food and the environment. I've been doing this since I graduated college in about 2007, 2008. And a friend sent me a link to this TEDx talk by Marcy Mayer, who's an expat living in California, from California, living in Greece. And the idea, she calls herself an acorn ambassador, and said we can eat
Mm.
acorns and they're a superfood, and not just a superfood, but one of our oldest and most important foods.
Mm.
And that idea just blew my mind, because I had never
Mhm.
heard anyone mention eating acorns. And I grew up in an oak forest, and I now live in a different oak forest. And the fact that we're sort of sweeping this food up and thinking of it as a nuisance, when for most of human history it's been a staple food, just
Mhm.
was so surprising to me that I immediately was like, okay, wait, I have to, what else am I missing? I need to learn a lot more about this whole other way of eating.
Yeah.
And you mentioned before that the book goes in so many directions, and for a while in the beginning, it was hard to figure out like what direction it was going in, because
Mhm.
acorns and learning that we can eat them was this like amazing connector to so
Mhm.
much of this other forgotten history,
Yeah.
and such a source of reconnection for me.
Yeah.
Yeah, and like you can really tell how much research you did for this book and the hundreds of references that you have in the back of the book.
And how much work my mother did helping me format those notes. She's a copy editor, and that was a labor of love. Yeah, I mean, the more I learned, the more interesting it got. It was one of those
Yeah.
topics where you learn a little and then you just want to keep digging, because it was like, oh, okay, there's people in Korea who have eaten acorns for thousands of years. There's a
Mm.
theory that as humans repopulated Northern Europe after the last glacial period, the reason oak trees were returning was because humans were bringing the acorns and planting them. There's
Ah.
yeah, like there's some research that suggests that the flow of rivers, which was the original theory for how acorns would get distributed after the last ice age, doesn't really explain oak distribution and how it moved through the pollen record very well, and that human activity actually explains it a lot
Mm.
better because humans, of course, would we're often going the opposite way up a river from the way the water's going.
Mm-hmm.
And just so many different cultures in so many different places tapped into these trees and really thinking about them as the keystone species that they are in a way that most of us have forgotten today.
Mm-hmm.
We don't talk about keystone species in agriculture almost at all, ever.
Nope.
And
No.
yet, that is the source of life in an
Mm-hmm.
ecosystem. And we can get a little deeper into that if you want to, but I just found that fascinating.
One of the things that was like really like new concept to us was thinking of humans as a keystone
Yeah.
species. So we really appreciated that perspective because like so often now we just hear that like, oh, humans are a cancer on this planet.
Doom and gloom. We bring nothing positive to the earth. And like I said, we're parents and we're around kids a lot. And now, like with his kids, I'm now a stepmother of teenagers. And so I'm a lot more interested in teenagers. And like, there's this huge, like, epidemic of, like, suicide and depression. And there's
Yeah.
lots of different things that it could be from. But I feel like a big part of it is, like, they're growing up in this culture in which they're told we are destroying the earth, like we are
Yeah.
inherently bad. And then instead of, like, I grew up feeling like, experiencing that, but then being like, oh well, I'm going to change it, I'm going to go in there and change it. But now, like, as they were growing up, they were having all these scientists say, like, well, maybe we have 10 years until
Yeah.
we're all dead,
Yeah.
it's too late. And now it's like, well, of course they're feeling depressed, and then they're like just giving up and saying, oh well, I might as well just feed into this consumerist society and not care about the earth. So it was so refreshing to hear someone talking about the environment, and also that we can be a part of making it better and taking care of the earth. That was beautiful.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the story that I grew up with, that, as you pointed out, has really accelerated for kids today, which Australian author James Boyce just calls this idea of being born bad, like the idea that
Mhm.
there's something fundamentally wrong with our species where we don't fit into the natural world the way that other species do. We don't have an
Mhm.
important role to play. Blue jays are out there planting oak trees, and every other species that you hear about has this important environmental niche, and then you hear about humans just destroying everything. And
Mhm.
that's definitely the story I grew up with. And I think about how many kids and girls in particular when I was younger, so many eating disorders, and
Mhm.
there's the beauty standards, yes, but like I've started to wonder recently, like people are trying to shrink. It's like, well, maybe the
Yeah.
world would be better if we just
Yeah.
disappeared.
Yeah,
And
Mhm.
there are less humans.
Mhm.
yeah, and less of us. And I think that when I started getting to know Ron Reed, who I talk a lot about in the book, who's a
Hmm.
Crook medicine man and indigenous cultural biologist, he introduced me to this whole other way of seeing humans. And traditional Karuk role on the landscape is to see themselves as fix the world people,
Mhm.
which
I
is
loved that.
just the opposite of what I grew up with. We're always told we were destroying the world. Um, and so the idea that humans could have a niche and a role to play, and that we actually, when I first met Ron, he kept describing oak trees as kin. And I thought,
Mhm.
well,
Mm.
that's
Hmm.
really
Mhm.
beautiful, and that's not so hierarchical, and that's like a really lovely way to see this relationship. But the more I learned about oak trees and humans and fire and our shared history, through at first what he was telling me about Karuk culture and then looking at other cultures all over the world, I started realizing, wait, not just in California, but in all these other places in North America, in places in Europe, in places, more in the Mediterranean region, in places in Asia, humans and fire and these keystone nut trees have this really ancient relationship.
Mhm.
And when we use fire on the landscape to create habitat for other species, and they're reliant on the fire, and we're reliant on them, we are kin in this way that I didn't see before, in a way where,
Mhm.
I always kind of am like, well, what would a Western scientist, how would they say it? Because like those are the adults that I grew up with. I'm like, what in
Mhm.
my native kind of science speak language, how would they say that? And it's like, oh, well, we've co-evolved. And that is
Mm.
just sort of another way of saying like
Mhm.
we're kin. We've been coming through
Yeah.
this together. And it's an incredibly life altering perspective to start to think about things that way.
Yeah, so that makes me. You're talking like trees as kin, and then the fire. Like my first kind of thought change towards that direction was reading Braiding Sweetgrass and Robin Wall
Mm.
Kimmerer talking about like plants and animals as kin, and then she told the stories of the fire that they used to use to clear.
I had never heard until reading your book. I don't remember. Well, maybe that was in the part of the book we haven't read yet, Reading
Oh
Sweetgrass.
yeah, we
That,
haven't
well, I
gone
mean,
through it
you've
yet.
read all of it, but I haven't read all of it yet. But I had never heard of indigenous people using fire, like besides to cook. And I loved that you called like we're the fire animals. That was. Can you
Yeah.
explain more about how people used fire in ancient times, not just now?
Yeah, well, it's really interesting. As I started getting to know Ron, and he was telling me about Karuk World Renewal ceremonies. So his
Mhm.
people hold these ceremonies every year where they intentionally burn different parts of the landscape to renew it, to bring back fire dependent species that the people and other animals and fish and other species depend on. And so I started looking into fire traditions in other cultures, and I started discovering that in almost every culture that I was looking at, part of the creation story or oldest mythology in these cultures were that humans either stole fire or were given
Mhm.
fire as a
Mm-hmm.
gift by the
Yep.
gods or spirit people or whoever it was in that culture. And it's a really common theme across so many cultures. So I started looking more at the history of humans and fire and kind of thinking about, well, why would that be important? Like why is this such a common theme? And around that time, I also came across a book called, I can't remember, I think it's called Mastering Fire by Richard Wrangham, I want to say. But he's this Harvard sociologist. I might not get the word quite right. Something something in that genre, but he was studying the human history relationship with fire. And he has this theory that actually, people say, well, walking upright or eating meat, these are the things that shifted our brains and our biology and made us human. But he actually posits that it's fire and that
Wow.
it's
Oh,
our
cooking
mastery
Interesting.
of
food.
fire. Because if you look at information about like physical information from primates that eat only raw foods, they have a completely different pelvic structure. They can't get as
Mhm.
much energy for their brain because cooking food is a technology. Like it externalizes this part of the digestion process so that you can get
Mhm.
more calories. So it's easier. You don't have to, your body doesn't have to use as much energy to digest. And what really amazed me was when I realized, okay, fire is this technology that we are depending on physically. And, today maybe it's an electric stove or a gas stove or not an open fire, but it's still fire,
Yeah.
in a different
Yeah.
format. And at the same time, it's also a technology that these oak trees have come to depend on in the way that we've mastered fire and they're fire adapted and we're burning to create through most of history in many places, we've been burning to create these conditions that they like on the landscape. And I started thinking about how that's not really that different than plowing a field to create the conditions that a corn seed or a wheat seed
Mm.
likes.
Mhm.
And this idea that there's some big dichotomy between those two actions is really part of that whole no farms, no food modern mythology. And so there were just so many things that started breaking down when I started learning more about that human relationship with fire and how ancient it is.
And I love every time you like learned something new, you had to go out and try it. Like you went to Burns and participated in doing
Yeah, that's how
burns.
we
Yeah,
are.
my
That's why we call
family
ourselves the
sometimes
squirrels.
loved that. Sometimes didn't. Yeah, got into all, so I have friends now who are like, and you're doing what now? Yeah, I did. I went on a lot of burns. I've gotten really, I love it. It's so cool. I went and got certified in prescribed fire, and I've been burning with mass wildlife. Um, the spring burn season is behind us, but I expect that soon I'll start getting emails again about the fall burn season because there's kind of this
Cool.
time in the summer when it's too hot and dry and you just can't really burn under prescribed fire conditions. But one of the first burns I went to, coincidentally, they had been, thinning and working to restore this oak savanna. So it's been really cool to actually be out there with a drip
Mm.
torch, be part of a burn. And then a few times I've gone back a couple months later to see what's happening. And like oaks are sprouting back, blueberries are coming back, huckleberries are coming back, and oak trees that are mature that we've burned around are thriving. They're completely
Mm.
unharmed and they've got all this space. And so it's kind of, trust but verify. Like it's one thing to write it, but it's another thing to actually get to experience and be like, okay, well, this is the nuance of that. And this is actually true. Like they're doing well with this cultural fire, and that's
Yeah.
just really fun to see.
Yeah, one part that this reminds me of in your book that I thought was like really fascinating was when you were in California with Ron Reed and the Karuk, is that, am I pronouncing it right?
Karuk, yeah,
Karuk.
yeah,
So that the land was taken from them and turned into national park, right?
national
And
forest.
national forest. And the like we think of like, oh, you take humans out of wildlife and then it thrives, but it was the opposite. You took the land from not you, but the land was taken from these people, and it's worse now. Can you talk more about that and how, because it doesn't have the fire anymore or the people to tend?
Yeah, I mean, there's a really awful history that I spent a lot of time on of, taking land from indigenous people and purposefully removing them from it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think people are becoming more aware of that history. It's not something that I feel like I heard about as a kid or a younger person, but I think it's becoming more prominent in the conversation now. And I think it's a
Yeah.
really important conversation that we as a country need to have.
Yeah.
But if you look at a lot of the bills for creation of national parks and national forests, when you look at the record, oftentimes the bill right before that bill to create the national park or national forest is a bill to remove the indigenous people from the area.
Ugh.
So many of these areas, like I live in Cape Cod National Park, so it's this seashore park on the
Mm.
end of Cape Cod. It's I don't know exactly how many acres. I want to say 45,000, and uh, it's described on the website as natural, pristine wilderness. And then in other areas of the website, there's language about fire and how important fire has been here in shaping the land and how humans have been burning here for thousands of years. And I think it's really telling when you look at the language that we use to describe wild spaces and some of these places that, are national parks and national forests. And when you look back, it's actually really clear how intentional the
Mm-hmm.
removal of human presence from the landscape in our language and in our stories is, because without that, you have to acknowledge the truth, which is that indigenous people of a variety of nations and cultures tended different areas for thousands of years and created the abundance and the
Mm-hmm.
landscape that was then taken and is now being managed in often completely different ways. I think that we're in an interesting time right now where Western science is sort of starting to ask some of the right questions to catch up with Indigenous knowledge,
Mm-hmm.
but that hasn't been true for most of the past several hundred years. And so often, science has meant putting down Indigenous knowledge, going in a different direction, pretending that those practices were harmful or asking different questions. And I think maybe it's a sign that we're ready to move in a different direction, that people are starting to ask different questions in the Western science world and starting to, if they hear something about indigenous knowledge, think like, okay, well, how could we ask a question that would support that, or, you know, look at that in a new way? So, yeah, I don't know where I'm going with that, except for that it's just, I just think it's an incredibly important conversation to keep having in this moment, because without acknowledging that history, I think we're just going to keep
Mhm.
repeating the same trajectory, and we can't afford that right now. That's
Right.
not a good direction for humans or for land or for other species.
Mhm.
Yeah, we need to bring
Well,
back traditional ecological knowledge.
yeah.
Yeah,
And I love history. I love learning about people, and
me too.
when we go to places, I love reading all the plaques that are out, and they're always like obviously very positive, but like in these parks, I always thought of it like, oh, isn't this great that they're like saving this land from what I thought was like, Euro-American settlers, like we're protecting it from, people who are going to come in and
Cut
live
all the
on it.
trees down.
Like I never thought about the fact that like, oh no, right before that they kicked everyone out. Like it's
Yeah,
awful.
and people who had a really intimate knowledge of that landscape. And
Yeah.
I think when we talk about protecting land from people, what we really mean is protecting land from our current economic system. And
Yeah.
it's complicated, because actually that is pretty important, because our current economic system is incredibly destructive toward
Mhm.
land and the living world around us. But it would be more honest to say we're going to protect this land from our economic system, and that doesn't necessarily mean protecting it from indigenous practices and from human presence.
Yeah.
Those are actually
Mhm.
two separate things that we tend to conflate.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
Yeah, and so we're fairly familiar with like indigenous history and like what Euro American or what the settlers did, and what's like even to this day still going on, like the Keystone XL pipeline, or what the pipeline in North Dakota, when there was the protesters out there trying to protect indigenous land. But we had no idea of the history of the commons that you talked about in the book, and like the removal of people from the commons and taking the commons from people.
Yeah, I had no idea either. I feel like that's a pretty big trauma in Euro American history that we have just completely swept under the rug in the
Yeah.
American public school system and our civic dialogue. It's not something that I've ever heard and now I hear about it all the time, because people are like, I saw that in your book, and I've heard of that, but just in normal conversations, it's not something that had ever come up for me. And as I started getting to know Ron Reed and learning more about Indigenous history, which I really did not know the details of, the 300 years of conflict between Euro Americans and Indigenous cultures across our continent. I knew sort of the broad strokes and the whitewashed version, but
Yeah.
not the real truth, and not the accurate version. And also how intimately tied in many cases it was to food systems and food production.
Mhm.
There's a lot of historians who call many of the tactics that Euro Americans used against indigenous communities a feed fight, because so often it was aimed at destroying food systems in order to weaken populations. And so as I learned more about that, I just kept thinking like, what is wrong with us? What is wrong with the people that I come from? Why would we do
Yeah,
this? And I had had like a series of experiences just sort of in my own life, and um, I had come to the conclusion just around that time that like I just didn't believe that people were inherently bad. Like I was done
Yeah.
believing that, and I was like,
Yep.
if people are doing something bad, there's a reason, like something has pushed them toward that. And that's
Mhm.
not to excuse the behavior, it's just to understand it, what's going on here, so that you can change it. You can't change
Right,
something
like
you
to
don't.
swim upstream, like they talk about with parenting, like swim upstream to find out what the real hurt was before.
Yeah, and so I started doing that, and I just thought, okay, well, if I don't believe that some people are just inherently awful, like what's going on here? Why why are people moving across a continent, destroying food systems in this way that really doesn't make a lot of sense? And the further back I went, I ended up finding this history of enclosure and internal colonization of Europe that I really knew nothing about.
Mhm.
And it's called the enclosures movement in England, and it was took place over an incredibly long time period from 1400s to really the 1900s. But there was this big push out of people off of traditional lands and off of lands that had been managed collectively and in common by communities right at the same time that thousands and then millions of Europeans were leaving Europe for North America. And I'm sure you grew up with the same story that I did, which was that Europeans came here because it was a land of opportunity.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Yep.
for
And as I
sure.
started thinking about that, I was like, what? Like,
What
actually,
what opportunity? What?
well,
Well, and
or
I
just
also
like,
heard
why
that
would
they
I
were like,
believe that? Like, you're gonna
Yeah.
go across an ocean where you're probably gonna die on the way and like leave everyone and everywhere you've ever known for an
Uh-huh.
opportunity? Like, that only makes sense if the place that you're living has become completely inhospitable
Yeah,
and you have
exactly.
nowhere else to go.
well, that's part
Yeah.
of what I heard was that, they were coming here because it was just the conditions over there were just getting so bad.
Yes. Yeah. And that's another way the story is told, right? Is that environmental conditions in Europe had become so bad and religious persecution had become so bad that this place was better. And like, there's maybe some element of truth to that story. But when you look at the historical records, about 75% of early Euro American migrants to North America came because they had lost traditional subsistence rights and could no
Mm.
longer access what used to be communally held lands that had been privatized. So they had nothing to eat and could not produce food. And there was a mass exodus to try to find a place to carry on those traditions. And that explains a lot of what you see in early North American colonial history, where some groups of people are perpetuating this trauma and
Mhm.
continuing to try to take land and move across the continent and destroy some of these communal and tree focused systems, and other communities are trying to recreate them. So there's this
Mhm.
tension between different Euro American forces, and it's the same tension that already existed in Europe when the enclosures began. And it
Yeah.
explains once you have that piece of the puzzle, it's like, okay, now I get what's going on here. It makes everything make sense.
Yeah. And to just kind of catch anyone up that doesn't understand what the commons were, we knew a little bit about it because, like I said, our friend started, the commoner, Montague Commoners, and has woods that they share communally. Um, but it was shared forest that everyone could go and forage in, and they had their own like homes around the forest and would but then everyone had access to foraging, so that's where like many poor people would go and could gather their food for the year, and then these enclosures took that away, privatized it, and gave it to the king or the lord. And I do remember hearing stories about like people poaching on on the lord's land
Like
and
Robin
like getting
Hood, and
killed. Yeah, like Robin
yeah.
Hood. But I didn't understand that people could go and forage there
Yeah, well,
before.
it's like we have some of the old stories, but we've lost the context, right?
Yeah,
Like we've lost the
exactly.
cultural context. And it wasn't actually just forest land. Like a lot of commons were woodland, but they were also cropland. It was
Uh,
pasture land. Most land was managed. So, like traditional European villages belonged to the Lord. So the Lord was the Lord of the manor. The village kind of was the manor. And then a
mhm.
little piece would belong to the church. A bunch of the land would be set aside. It was the Lord's kind of personal grounds. And then most of the rest of it was divided up among the commoners. And there's also so much language, right? A common person, the House of Commoners in English
Yeah.
law. A villain was an old word for sort of a serf peasant farmer. And then as
Mm.
commons were privatized, a villain became, you know, this law-breaking person who's trying to access this land.
Uh,
So there's when we look back through our language and our stories, it's all there, but we've lost the context, so we don't understand it the way that people at the same time that, those words were changing would have. So there's such a wealth of information sort of hiding in plain sight when we go
Mhm.
back and understand our stories in this new context.
Yeah.
There's a really cool woman, Joanna Brooks, whose book I used a lot when I was writing my book called Why We Left, and she focused on all these ballads of the first immigrants who came to North America from Europe. And
Mm.
she had heard the same land of opportunity story and was finding that all the ballads were like these like murderous, bloody heartache ballads. And she was like, this doesn't really sound like a land of opportunity song line. And that was,
Yeah.
I learned a lot from reading her book and just, following some of those songs back alongside her. It's a great read. I would highly recommend it to listeners.
Yeah. Yeah, I when you actually you use the word refugees,
Yeah.
that really hit me deep of like, oh, like I don't know, I had never thought of it that way. And again, it doesn't excuse the behavior of, what was done
No.
to the settlers, but it also just like it makes it make a little bit more sense that it was like trauma being passed down. And yeah.
Yeah. And I think, it also makes sort of our obsession with certain aspects of farming make sense because
Yeah.
I think that there's this nostalgia that's been passed down through generations for this sort of traditional European farm and the
Mhm.
species that were there. And I spent some time when I was researching the book actually going to England to one of the oldest communally managed forests, a place called the New Forest that hasn't been enclosed, that wasn't taken during the enclosure movement, and that still is managed in the traditional way. Commoners can turn their livestock out. There's still a commoners association. The
That's
animals
amazing.
move. It's such a cool place. It's called the New Forest. Animals are moving through the village. If you don't want animals in an area, you have to fence them out as opposed
Yeah,
to
I
fencing
loved
them
that.
in. And
Yeah, I loved reading that. I was just like, oh my God, this sounds like a magical place.
it's a really cool place. But I think what struck me the most was like, oh, here on this landscape, these farm animals that we think of as farm animals, like these ponies, cattle, pigs, they're part of the native flora and fauna of this ecosystem. They're not this separate introduced species the way that they are in North America. And so
Mhm.
when we're creating these farms in North America, it's like this intergenerational trauma of like we're just still not ready to accept that we had to leave that place and that we're in this new place, and instead of
Yeah.
getting to know like, well, how do we do things here and how do we interact with the species that are here and the other cultures that are here, it was like because of that trauma, I think this attempt, we're kind of still trying to hold on to that old place, and I think it's really time to decide like what we're doing here. Are we,
Yeah.
it's been hundreds of years now, and there's a lot of intercultural and interpersonal healing work to do, and also a lot of ecological healing work to do.
Yeah, I like that you quoted
I was going to say the same
Robin Wall
thing.
Kimmer again, that people still have one foot in the boat.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think you can really see that in our food
Yeah,
system,
Yeah,
you
totally.
know?
yeah.
Yep.
So I want to jump to where you were talking about Hershey and the tree plantings,
Mm.
Yeah.
and it brings a question about my family history. So I grew up in Southwest Michigan on a fruit
Okay.
farm. So my grandma owned a fruit farm. My grandpa had died like 8 years before I was born, and it's like 100 and some acres. We had apples and cherries and peaches. And in the book you talked about, and I don't remember the timeline. I wish I had taken more notes on this. But you mentioned there was a time when the government was giving like trees and land for like planting like fruit trees, and I'm really curious if that was a part of that.
I think that probably would have been outside of the geographic area, but I'm not sure. It would be interesting to research. So, where Hershey was, so John Hershey was a Quaker. He came of age during the Great Depression and was really into tree crops for the same reason a lot of people are into tree crops now, right? Like, if you're working on a hilly system or anywhere where you're going to have erosion, tree crops are going to do a lot better than annual row crops. And he
Yeah.
saw what was going on with the Dust Bowl and some of like, we kind of forget, but a lot of Appalachia and the eastern area of North America during that time period was heavily deforested. There had been chestnut blight that had wiped out this
Mm.
incredibly important chestnut species that, was 4 billion strong up and down the east. There were a lot of fires, forest fires that had occurred because not, very different from a prescribed burn that were occurring because of drought that was happening because of sort of mismanaged waterways and erosion. And so they were having these alternating cycles of flooding and drought, and it was just devastating forests. And that was on top of chestnut blight and some other tree diseases and tons of logging. So as chestnuts succumbed to blight, logging moved in to just completely clear them and often took other trees too. So there were these denuded landscapes in a lot of Appalachia and Eastern North America that, now we think of it as so heavily forested, but that's not what was going on at the time. And Hershey saw
Hmm.
that and thought, well, why don't we kill two birds with one stone? We could plant food trees, produce food for
Mm-hmm.
humans and livestock, and solve a lot of these ecological problems. And his ideas
Yep.
went all the way up to the top of, the Roosevelt administration.
Yep.
And they started this experimental nursery, which was part of the Tennessee Valley Association. So today we think of those initiatives. What ended up enduring was like dams to produce electricity
Yeah.
Yep.
and these sort of more industrial projects. But at the time that it started, one of the main solutions was these tree crops, and they were sending out tens of thousands of fruit and nut seedlings all over the Tennessee Valley area. And so I think Michigan would have probably been a little too far north, but there was also Roosevelt's Tree Army where they were
That's what
sending,
I was
Yeah,
gonna
that's the
say. That
one.
was in
yeah,
Michigan. Yeah.
yeah, so they were sending trees in general all over to try to help with erosion and dust bowl control. But often, I think outside of that Hershey experimental nursery in the Tennessee Valley Authority area, most of those trees were sort of just for erosion and less for food production.
Oh, gotcha.
But I haven't studied that as much, and there may very well be exceptions where there were forward-thinking individuals, running certain nurseries or distribution centers where they were getting these trees out, where they could have been other species. So it'd be really interesting to look into the local history on that
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
land.
fruit orchards were really common where I grew up, and then there's like cluster of them like kind of north of where we're at now, and then you go further like up further in northern Michigan. It's like what's known as like the cherry
Yeah, I was gonna
area.
say Michigan's a big fruit state, right?
Oh yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, and it's interesting. Like, so the farm I grew up on was a conventional fruit farm. So one of my favorite things to do when I was a kid was ride in the tractor with the person who was spraying pesticides on the trees,
Perfect.
and like, yeah, yeah, I just loved riding, like doing that, being on
I
the
mean, it sounds
tractors.
fun if you don't know
Yeah,
what's
Yeah.
yeah,
happening.
and now as an adult, like I've learned about that, and I'm like I've gone completely the opposite way. Like I go like teaching like growing without pesticides and like focusing on building soil like that. We consider soil our first crop here. Like we're building soil. And as we were reading the book, I'm like, oh man, I can't wait to talk to her and tell her about biochar. And then we hit your fires, your fire chapter, and like, oh, she knows, great.
Yeah, I mean, that's a whole other fascinating side of these cultural fires and indigenous practices that have been really common all over North America is each time, and this was something I spent a lot of time calling around, talking to different soil experts on because it's confusing when you start learning about biochar and prescribed fire. And I was like, well, there's got to be a connection between the fact that people were burning the land and biochar is good for soil. And there's this incredibly fertile soil in the Midwest from, I'm guessing, from these fires. But it took a lot of talking to different people to really start connecting those dots because when you burn under different conditions, you produce different results, right? So if you're having these
Mm-hmm.
really hot forest fires, like some of what we're seeing out west right now,
Mm-hmm.
where there hasn't been prescribed burning and hasn't been these cooler fires, these like more carefully managed fires, things just uh, go up in flame and you get a lot of ash and not a lot of that black char matter.
Yeah.
Oh
But
yeah,
when
that's
you,
true.
yeah, when you're burning under more regular conditions, a few biochar experts and soil scientists who I talked to note that you get more of the char matter proportionally. So you're always going to get, some gases, some ash, some charcoal, basically.
Yeah.
And depending on how you're burning and when you're burning, you can manipulate conditions to, or adapt to conditions. Really, you're not manipulating them. But if you're, say, burning like right before a rain or,
Yeah.
at a wetter time versus a drier time, you'll get more or
Mhm.
less of that black matter. And it turns out that that charred matter is incredibly important for soil fertility. And so
Mhm.
when we're thinking about forest management and climate change and wildfires, we're often talking about sort of like the short term carbon cycle, right? Like, okay, there's the carbon in the trees, that's kind of short term. There's the carbon that's going into the atmosphere when they burn, that's short term. But if we can produce a lot of biochar in more prescribed fires, that's actually getting locked into this whole longer term carbon cycle, which is that same timeline of like fossil fuels and that other cycle that we've sort of accidentally and now continually on purpose are pulling from, that's throwing everything out of whack. And
Yeah.
we tend to talk about the carbon cycle in general, but like there is like a short-term carbon cycle and a long-term carbon cycle, and biochar is really interesting in that it increases soil fertility. It's critical to so many of these native ecosystems, and it taps into that longer term carbon cycle. So I think there's so much we still don't know, but there's so much potential and so much to learn.
Yeah, I'd love to, like, we want to focus on, like, asking you questions, but we'd love to talk to you sometime outside of this too and tell you what we're doing here. One of the things I've developed is biochar, da, 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 biochar, I'm blanking on
Gasifier.
gasifier.
Oh,
So,
cool.
in permaculture, we think of function stacking, and every time I make biochar, I'm like, man, I wish I could use this heat for something. I feel like I'm just wasting all this heat. So I created a biochar maple boiler. So now I can boil our maple sap while making biochar. So it's carbon negative maple syrup.
That is pretty cool. That's awesome. I'll have to, I don't know if you remember reading about Bob Wells in the book, but
Oh
he's
yeah.
a
Yeah.
friend and a neighbor, and he actually, we just got this sort of biochar making fire pit from him, and he
Oh, cool.
added a grill so that you can cook, you can barbecue while while you biochar. So you two are
Yeah.
thinking along the same veins.
I made one for Wiley over at Montague Commoners that they got a huge stock pot from the Amish stores, and I made them a biochar boiler that they can put that on to
That's
like
awesome.
boil down tomato sauce or do canning on while they're
Yeah, to
making
do canning.
biochar.
Yeah.
Nice. Oh, that's so awesome. Yeah, I think one thing that happened as I was researching and talking with folks for the book is once you unlock this idea that humans could be ecologically good, it's like all these new pathways start to show up.
Uh huh.
If your brain is
Hmm.
sort of wired for this story of humans as ecologically bad, I think it's almost a self-fulfilling prophecy. Like that's what you
Yeah.
expect and that's what you look for and that's what you see. And when you start to expect the opposite, like at first,
Mhm.
I feel like I would kind of hope for the opposite. And the more I learned, I was like, no, I expect the opposite. I expect that there's a way to be a positive part of this ecosystem. And the more that I expect that, the more that it shows up and the more it's a possibility. And it's just such an exciting way to see the world after a lifetime of living in that other story. I was just at the Northern Nut Growers Association conference, actually in
Mm.
Lansing, Michigan. I had never
Oh,
been to
Oh.
bummer.
Michigan.
Missed
I
you.
know. It was cool. I loved Michigan. And I met a young woman there who was learning how to do hedge laying, which is this ancient
Oh, cool.
English
Yeah.
practice of sort of renewing the hedge, but not totally killing it and producing all this wood for basketry and other materials. And so I feel like every time I turn around now, I'm meeting another person who's found a pathway
Mhm.
toward, reconnection and reconnecting those dots of how we can be a positive force on the land. And it's really exciting.
And here, part of what we do is when we learn this knowledge, we go out and teach it so that we're spreading it so that
Mhm.
more people start doing it. So I love, like, we just had a Skillshare weekend 3 weekends ago now, and I did a biochar workshop, and somebody messaged last week and said I've started making biochar now, and that's
Mhm.
I've
Yes.
heard that so many times.
Yeah,
It's exciting.
it's really
We
exciting. Thank you for
and then
doing
like
that.
and then we always say like, you know, please don't take when we're teaching workshops, we don't want to be like the experts who know everything and
Yeah.
this is the way you have to do it. It's like, no, please experiment with us. What have you done? How is it different? And like, how can we exchange all this information to make like the best possible? Because like you said in the book, and something I've heard a lot is like, this knowledge was taken and we
Yeah.
have to relearn it now because it
Yeah.
was just like it's just been taken away, and so we have to share all the knowledge that we can so that we can grow together to find the best possible solutions.
Yeah, and there's so much to learn, and the more we can do together, I've had a lot of people since I wrote the book asking like, okay, well, what do you think should be the vision for tree crops or like this one thing? And I don't think any one person should hold that vision. What I tried
Yeah.
to do in the book is make a lot of connections so that
Hmm.
Mhm.
I can be part of sort of rewiring our story circuit because I think that's a really
Yeah.
important first step. But in terms of the actual like particulars, like that is for individual communities and regions and watersheds and people working together
Mhm.
to kind of figure out for each of our places because so much ecological knowledge is really place specific and it doesn't work the way our culture does where we tend to kind of want to figure out one thing and then make that for everyone. That's not like the
Yeah.
Yeah.
first thing I learned
Yeah.
about fire was basically like, oh, it's really different everywhere and you actually have to do it a lot and get to know the place and
Uh-huh.
have decades or years and then centuries of knowledge to do it skillfully. And, when you do what Euro American culture has done and move across the continent, destroying these systems of knowledge that Indigenous people
Yeah.
had built up over thousands of years, then you end up where we are today, which is at a point of, you know, not having nearly the knowledge that was here before of how to interact with the landscape.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's like it's really nice finding other people who are finding the knowledge and sharing it. So like we really appreciate what you're doing.
Thank you. Yeah, I always get excited when I'm meeting other people who are reconnecting, not just like with Indigenous heritage here, but also like the woman who was going back to England to learn this traditional hedge laying.
Mhm.
Because I think there's so much that we can all learn from each other. And that was a big part of the book for me was following back sort of like, well, what would my ancestors have been doing? And then how do I take that knowledge that my people had and then also understand the knowledge that people living here have had and continue to have and integrate those to figure out a healthy relationship with place.
Yeah. Yeah, people are so disconnected from their food, and I really also appreciated that you talked about that, like, and the effect that that's having on people's health,
Yeah.
because it's like so many people don't want to hear it. They're like, "What?" And I hear so often they're like, "I'd rather, um, I just want to like indulge now, and like if I live a little bit, if I don't live as long, whatever, at least I had fun." And I'm like, "Why? Like you could feel
Yeah,
better for the time that you're here if you if you eat better rather than spending half of your life sick."
my
Yeah.
daughter's poking her head in. Not right now, bud. I love you. um, yeah, I think we're kind of tricking ourselves when we think that that's fun because what's really fun, or at least to me, is to be connected to a place and to be connected to the people where you are and to find meaning in that relationship. Uh, there's so much joy in reconnecting with lost skills and with other species. And I think that, there's, like you mentioned earlier, there's such a loneliness epidemic right now. And I think a lot of that
Yeah.
is like loneliness for plants and animals and to be part of a place in a
Yeah.
meaningful way. And I think that when you see people immersed in that work, it's really joyful. And so this idea that like that has to be a big sacrifice, that was the other story I grew up with, like helping the
Yeah.
environment is going to be a bummer. I don't believe
Yeah,
that at all
totally.
anymore.
No.
I
Yeah.
don't think that's true.
My aunt still like my grandma's fruit farm still exists, but my aunt has it now, but she's getting up there in age, so she's like leasing it out, and like the trees are getting removed, and they're just like doing like field, like I don't know, corn, and so I haven't gone and looked at it. But I used to talk to her. I'm like, well, have you ever thought about going organic? She's like, yeah, it's not really realistic.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah,
not.
well, and it does a lot of when we're saying like something is or is not realistic, like we were talking about before in terms of like protecting land from humans. So
Mhm.
often it's like, well, we made up this economic system. We could change it.
Yep.
Not one of
Yep.
us, but many of us. And I
Yeah.
think that that's going to be a really important piece of any kind of successful ecological shift, because we
Mhm.
all are sort of forced to operate under this system right now, and it doesn't play well with the rules of ecology. We talk
No.
about
Yeah.
economic law as if it's the same sort of natural law as ecological law or other types of laws like gravity, but it's just made up.
Yeah.
It's not,
Yeah.
Yeah.
it doesn't work like that. Whereas like gravity and ecology, those are real and they don't shift.
Yeah. You can't have infinite growth on a finite planet.
No,
Yeah.
it's not going to work.
Guess they're
Right.
gonna have to go to Mars.
Some people maybe. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and I think, our culture, we tried so hard to be the island. We got rid of the villages, and now we have to be these like self-sufficient nuclear family islands. And I think that made us feel alone and isolated us, and that well, there must not be anyone else out there that thinks like me.
Yeah.
Like I thought like that. I was the only one of my friend group that was thinking about the things that I was thinking about. And it was like, oh, well, I just needed to find other friends. And they're out there. And it's like once I started being like, no, this is a way that we could live life, then I find these people. And I'm like, okay, I'm not the only one. And if we just all continue doing that, and that's like again part of what we want to do with the podcast, and how Mike and I are, we're building an intentional community here, but that's one of our values is connecting people and connecting ideas.
Yeah. We consider ourselves a mycelium because
Yeah.
we're connectors.
That's beautiful. I love that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean,
And I
it's
think it's really
all.
important.
I ended the book with a quote that I have, my sister had on her fridge, and I'm gonna misremember
Yeah.
a little bit, but hold on, I'm actually just gonna find it because it's such a good one. It's like,
It's such a good quote.
Yeah.
um, it speaks to the ways that we are all connected and that all of this work is connected.
Yeah, I read it and I was like, I'm going to write this up on our wall
It's a good one.
because I love it.
Yeah, so it says it can be overwhelming to witness, experience, take in all the injustices of the moment. The good news is that they're all connected. So if your little corner of work involves pulling at one of the threads, you're helping to unravel the whole damn cloth. And that's another way of saying, be part of the mycelium and
Yeah.
Yeah.
good things will happen.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, one thing that coming back to acorns. So like I said, we've now been like collecting acorns and taking the cap off and looking in them. As we've been sitting here, I've actually been like cracking them open and pulling out the little nut meats out because it's something fun to do with my hands. But the nut weevils that you talked about and the
Yeah.
fire burning them out, Mike actually took that idea and applied it to apples.
Yeah. So
Hmm.
I lived at a place almost a decade ago now that had hickory trees, and I found little
Yeah.
hickory nuts on the ground. I'm like, oh, I wonder if I could eat those. So I looked it up, and I'm like, yep, you can eat hickory nuts. So I was like cracking them open, but I kept coming across nut weevils in most of them.
Yeah.
So I got digging, and it said that to not have nut weevils, you need to remove the previous year's nuts because of the life cycle. They come out of the nut, they go back in the ground, then they come out of the ground the next year and go reinfect the nuts. And so if you want to like not have nut weevils. You got to collect all the nuts so to break that cycle. And the last house that we lived at had 2 old apple trees,
Hmm.
and the apples were very buggy and like really ugly apples. And like I could pick one and like I could maybe like get a bite off of like each apple that it
Yeah.
wasn't bad, but they're the most delicious apples. I think that it was a Macintosh and a Golden Delicious tree that were there. And like Golden Delicious apples, I don't. Growing up on a fruit farm, it's really hard for me to go to the store and buy apples.
I bet.
Uh, like nobody that doesn't have a Gala apple tree in their backyard, they have no idea what a Gala apple tastes like off the tree, because in the store they don't taste like that. Like they've got this. There's just this sweet, like I can't even describe it. There's just a taste to them that the ones in the store don't have. But anyway, like Golden Delicious, like even on the farm we grew up on with the sprayed trees, were pretty boring apples. But the ones that aren't sprayed have so much flavor to them.
Mm.
So I wanted to nourish these trees. So like I found a podcast that talked about using like willow mulch, and then I was looking at the like the bugs in them. I'm like, what if I apply the same principle to nut trees and I remove all the apples that are
Mm.
on the ground? So I
Yeah.
did that. I removed all the apples and I either composted or gave them to the chickens depending on the year. And then we started getting much better apples. So like we could
Mm.
go out to those trees, and like each tree we get about 6 bushels of apples off of, and they were mostly good. So we made like a ton of applesauce and like dried apple chips. So it's yeah, so
That's
that was
amazing.
interesting.
And it kind of reinforces something that kept coming up when I was researching the book was that, because of the stories that so many of us are learned, we tend to think that hands off and not touching is better for plants.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
But a lot of plants really do better with interaction.
Yeah.
A lot of the nut trees that I was looking at in the book, they like to be cut back or burned or even hit with a stick during harvest to do this sort of
Yeah.
renewal pruning. And I've found the same is true with like the kale in my garden. If I pick the kale
Mm-hmm.
often,
Mhm.
I don't get an infestation of the cabbage worms. If I
Mm.
stop picking the kale, the life cycle of the worms doesn't get interrupted, and so they just proliferate and they eat holes in all the cabbage. And it's a good reminder to sort of check our assumptions about whether or not a plant wants interaction and to actually observe and try different things and see if it does or not. Just check that as our default assumption, because often it's not true. Often a little human intervention can be a great thing for a plant.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, that was amazing. Yeah. So another thing that we haven't touched on in the book was food and like the politics of food. I was not expecting you to go there because that's something that I'm really passionate about too, and the like fat shaming
Yeah.
of the in the sugar industry, and how the lobbyists, like, you were talking as we were reading, you were talking about how when they got together to figure out like what the recommendations were for daily sugar.
Oh yeah, yeah. I listened to a podcast a few years ago, and it was by one of the doctors that was on the board that helps determine like what goes on the nutrition facts labels. And he said that they ended up making the RDA for sugar twice what it should what the doctors were recommending because of industry lobbyist pressure.
Yeah.
Like we should
Yeah.
not be taking like we should not be putting corporation profits above people's health. Like that is so ridiculous to me in this country.
Yeah. It So when I was working on that chapter, again, there was a lot of indigenous history of like what our government has done in terms of taking indigenous land and then giving indigenous communities rations, which were usually have traditionally been some of the worst food that we produce in this country. And
Yep.
then there's been these really clear health results. Diabetes starts appearing, all these other diseases related to blood sugar and to the way that our metabolism functions when we're forced to eat a high sugar diet, basically. Um,
Yeah.
and fat became this dietary villain because of government storytelling. And we're, I think, starting to see that change. There's a lot of awareness around sugar consumption now, but I wouldn't be surprised if in 20 years people talk about sugar and the sugar industry the way that we talk about nicotine and tobacco, because there has, like you said, been this really intentional uh, drive to misstate facts and to tell
Yeah.
a different story than what's true. And, I remember my dad every night when I was a kid, he ate nuts. He grew up in France and he kind of didn't buy into any of the American nutrition mythology. He was like lived in his own nutrition world. He used to make us butter and liverwurst sandwiches, and he was always eating nuts, and he's super healthy. Like he's
Yeah.
doing great. He's in his 70s. And so as I started thinking about, well, like, what would it look like if we actually replaced a lot of these refined grains, which, in a lot of ways, your body is uh, it's just like sugar to your body. When you've taken out all the fiber
Yeah.
and the nutrients, you're basically just getting glucose. And it, the answer pretty quickly became like, well, it would depend what you did to the nuts, because there's nothing wrong with whole grains, and inherently they're not bad
Yeah.
for our body. They're great for our body.
Yeah.
But when you start refining them and processing them, then you get a really different product. And the same is true for something, like a chestnut or an acorn that has more carbohydrates. It would be pretty hard to refine a walnut or a hazelnut into a carbohydrate because it's mostly fat. Um, but as I thought about that, I really started to think about the ways that our government has sort of disconnected healthy eating from healthy places.
Mhm.
And the fact that, we talk about not just, even if we're just talking about food separate from the landscape, but then we're talking about like macronutrients in the food separated from each other, separated from nutrients. And I had this moment of like, I'm working on the manuscript and I'm like, well, I don't know if this recommendation is right or this recommendation is right. And then I realized like, okay, every culture that you hear about where they're in good health, the land is in good health. Like it's actually
Yeah.
not as complicated as we're making it. A healthy
Yeah.
diet is food that's coming from a healthy place. And that healthy place is going to tell you how much of these different food groups it can support, how much is
Mm.
available. And that's not to say that we can't work within that system to increase abundance and to favor certain species, but you're
Yeah.
never going to have a healthy diet from an industrial monoculture because it's not a healthy place. And I think that as a starting point, rather than getting caught up in these sort of tiny questions, like let's start with the big question of how do we make this place healthy? And then we can kind of tweak, like, okay, well, what if we worked the system a little differently to produce more of this because we really like that and, we really want that. But the sort of nutrition and lobbying has gotten so far away from that and so political that it's it's gotten really confusing to figure out,
Yeah.
you know, well, what does a healthy human diet look like? And one of the cool things is that it can look like almost anything. You can go way up north, in Inuit culture and cultures up there where it looks like mostly mammal meat. You can go somewhere else and it's very plant-based, and like humans are very adaptable and there's so many different diets that we can thrive on, and the common denominator is that the ecosystem is in good health and that we're in good relationship with it.
Did you,
Yeah.
um, speaking of the healthy soil, I can't remember if it was you said you got to go see the terra preta soil, or you
Oh
interviewed
yeah.
somebody who did.
Yeah. Yeah,
Bob
you did.
Wells. I
Yeah.
didn't see it. So Bob Wells,
Oh,
who
right.
lives in the next town over from me, who makes biochar, he was sort of one of the early people getting interested in biochar, like a few decades ago, early Euro-American people, I guess I would say. And he got to go on this trip to the Amazon and see terra preta, which is this black
Mm.
earth created in the Amazon through intentional indigenous burning. And he said, I mean, it was incredible. They had excavated this sort of 6 by 6 foot pit, and they
I've
had a
seen the picture.
ladder. Yeah, they had a ladder down into it. And he said, there are shards of pottery mixed in. There was, all the sort of kitchen waste got burned, and it just created
Mhm.
this incredible. soil. So even places like the Amazon, which, now we hear about wildfires in the Amazon, but actually that area does have this history of human fire, and it's all a matter of nuance. Whether it's good
Mhm.
fire or bad fire depends on, are people using it skillfully? Are we using it intentionally? Or have we forgotten our job as this fire animal and we're just letting fire control us instead of the other way around?
So you talked about when he got up, they went down the river, and they had to
Yeah.
like cut steps into the side of the cliff to go up it, and they had to put boards on it because the clay there was so slippery. It
Yeah.
reminds me, a few years ago, we went with the kids to like a corn maze, and it
Yeah.
was like in a conventional cornfield, and the soil there was just gross. It was like this just slimy, sticky clay mess. It wasn't soil anymore. And you talking about that in the Amazon reminded me of like that's what they're turning the where they grow corn. That's what they're turning that soil into.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, soil is alive, and I think that a lot of us are just starting to understand what that means, and what we need to shift in order to keep it alive.
Yeah.
And trees, are a huge part of that. When you're ripping open the land every year over these huge areas, and I just want to, say, like, there's nothing wrong with a little bit of annual crop growing. I think it's a really important part of the food system. But when you're doing it over huge swaths of the heartland of our country, and you're not having these crops that, instead of off gassing carbon, are putting carbon into the soil every year and are creating soil life, things get out of balance.
Mhm.
And trees are a huge food source and can also be a huge way of getting that cycle back in balance.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, and I like how like in the early part of the book how you talked about you met Mark Shepard, and I
Yeah.
read his book Restoration Agriculture a few years ago and really enjoyed that one. So that was fun to see that you like got to talk to him and like go out and see his place.
Yeah, he is a beautiful place. He had, I think, over 139 edible perennial species growing.
Wow.
Wow.
So, I mean, it was just incredibly lush and abundant. And a endangered rattlesnake had just come onto his property,
Oh, cool.
which they thought really was being lost in the area. And a rattlesnake, I was reflecting, is maybe not like the first endangered species that you're excited to see back, but it is such a sign that, like, he planted his farm on this degraded corn and soy land that was basically
Mm.
devoid of most life, and now it's home
Mm.
to an endangered species and is producing a ton of human food.
Beautiful.
Yeah, the front portion of our property is becoming silvopasture.
That's
So
exciting.
that's like getting the lines of trees in there, and been using ducks for a few years now to build the soil here because it
Yeah.
was like it's just sand here. So we're like it's a lot of work to build the soil. And I know a permaculture teacher who's like not a fan of biochar, but he's always had good soil where he's at. But I'm like, here where we have sand, it makes a huge difference.
Mhm.
Yeah, Cape Cod is basically just a sand spit, so I have seen an incredible difference using biochar.
Mhm.
I think
Yeah.
it's really, really important for just holding water even. We were just doing a big tree planting in Maine. We have some land in Maine near where my family is, and we planted a bunch of chestnuts, hickories, hazelnuts, and cold hardy pecans. And we did an experiment where some of the holes we put a lot of biochar in, and some we did none. And even just watering the seedlings in the first day, the holes with the biochar held onto that water. Like when you walked by 10 minutes later, the water was still trickling down, still moving
Mm,
through,
Mm.
and the
Wow.
holes with no biochar were completely, the water was gone.
Wow.
yeah,
So
that's
we could
Yeah.
amazing
see it
hearing those
in real
stories.
time, which was cool.
Yeah. Well, I know that we're running out of time, but I had one more fun question that we read
Yeah.
this and we just kept asking. We were like, oh, we have to ask her this. Okay, so when you're in England in the Commons and there's the horses that are running all over, um, so like I don't know, maybe there's like other uses for horses, but I think of horses as like riding on them. Like, how do you like then get your horse and like want to just like run away?
Well, there were some stories that the women who I was spending time with there were telling about catching horses. So I do think it can be a little bit of an act, some work that you have to do. But what was interesting was they weren't riding all of them, I don't think. Some of
Mm.
them were they were breeding off of, so like they would sell
Okay.
the foals.
Uh-huh.
Um, but they had a really cool relationship where these animals were, they kept describing them to me as semi-feral. So,
Yeah.
you know, they own them, but not in the way that you think of like a horse in a paddock. Like
I
they're out
love that.
there and they can
Yeah.
identify them. But there was one story, I wish I could remember it, of a horse that kept escaping, and um, they were trying to bring it in, maybe because it was going to have a foal. I can't remember why they were trying to bring it into sort of the more enclosed area near the barn, and it just kept leaving. So I
It's like,
think
no,
that
I'm free now.
yeah, there's a little bit of navigation that happens in terms of that relationship, and I think it's different with like the pigs and stuff because all you have to do to get the pigs to come back is offer them some food because
Yeah.
that's their nature. But ponies are a
Yeah.
little more finicky.
Yeah. I love that. Like I love horses and like I feel conflicted about human relationships with horses and that we just like, they just carry us around everywhere and so I loved the idea of just these like feral horses. It's like maybe they'll let you ride them, maybe they won't. Who knows?
It's up to them.
It's up to them. It's
Yeah,
consensual.
yeah, I think it definitely is. There's so much room in that area that like if that horse really did not want to be near you, I'm sure there are tricks, but it would be a lot of work.
Yeah. That's cool. Well, so like we told you, we usually like to end on the forest echo. If you'd love to, we'd love it if you would read us your favorite part of the book or part of the book.
I
If
was,
you're,
yeah, I would love to. I was trying to decide what to read, but I think I'm going to read from a passage that um, is really special to me about weaving that most
mm,
people don't end up touching on because it's a little outside the normal bounds of acorn focused conversation, but it's become a practice that's really important to me and something that I do a lot now. So,
I love it. Yes.
all right, I'll dive in.
All
All
right.
right.
So this is we're going to start from the beginning of chapter 8, which is titled The Magic of Twigs. On a sunny afternoon in early September, my 9-year-old daughter Nora and I stood around a table, bending twigs into baskets. In front, behind, I chanted softly to myself, in front, behind. Beside me, Nora had developed her own incantation, humming a made-up tune that reminded me of the song Farmer Brown's cows sing in the picture book Doobie Doobie Moo. We were in a barn in Cape Ann, Massachusetts, about an hour's drive north of Boston, at a weekend-long weaving course. We moved slowly, fingers straining against the strength of our twigs as we attempted to twist them into shape. Remember to boss your uprights, our teacher, Mary Lauren Fraser, reminded the class, otherwise the sides will be crooked. I glanced at the woman across from us and she grimaced. Clearly, Nora and I weren't the only beginners here. Easier said than done, I muttered and inserted a new round of twigs into the weave. It was our second morning, and my shoulders and neck and fingers were still sore after a solid 6 hours of weaving the day before. Fraser is an expert weaver, schooled in northern Scotland by a master named Karen Collins, who believes that the highest form of art is to take things that most people consider nothing, piles of sticks, and turn them into something useful. Fraser met Collins on a trip to her ancestors' home in the Scottish Highlands in 2014 and was immediately taken with weaving. I want to do that. I have to do that, Fraser says she remembers thinking. She ended up going back to apprentice for 3 months, and by the time she came home to Massachusetts, had decided to start a business weaving caskets for green burials. On the side, she teaches. This morning, Fraser walked around the barn offering small corrections, tips, and instructions, including for the simpler weave she had taught Nora. We each held 6 pinky thick, roughly 10-inch long sticks in front of us, and at first it was hard to believe that these would become a basket. To start, we used a knife to pry open the middle sections of one set of 3 sticks, so that the other 3 could be stuck through them and create a cross. From there, we began weaving smaller twigs around this T-shaped center. Behind and up, behind and up, behind and up, Fraser had demonstrated with her own weave, showing us how to make the twigs splay out as we wove, slowly transforming our crosses into bicycle spokes, and then how to fill in the spokes to create a solid circle. When we all had round finished bases, Fraser had showed us how to add the uprights, long, strong sticks that make up the sides of the basket by being stuck into the base and then bent up at a 90-degree angle. We'd tied these together at the top to keep them out of the way while we wove, and this morning the frames looked something like old-fashioned bird cages. Today our task was to learn the ancient European techniques of building up the sides of the baskets, wailing, joining, French randing, wrapping, and eventually constructing the final border and twisted bow handles. The work was hot and sticky, and already by 10:30 my shorts and t-shirt were damp with sweat and the wet dirt that came off the twig's bark. To get the dry sticks ready for weaving, Fraser had soaked them in a river near her house, and after several days wrapped in wool to keep them damp, they filled the lofted barn with a pungent, earthy scent that I found intoxicating. The smell and the heat and the rhythm of my hands began to lull me into a sort of focused trance, and I slowly built up the sides, twig by twig. At noon, we sat on the grass outside the barn, eating our picnic lunches. Except for Nora, we were all women, and at first we sat in pleasant, companionable silence, the only sounds those of hungry chewing and sipping. As we filled our bellies, though, the chatter began, and two women sitting near me began talking about what had inspired them to sign up for the class. One was heavily pregnant, a surrogate mother, here to take her mind off her growing belly. The other was retired and in need of a new hobby. "What about you?" they asked, and at first I wasn't quite sure what to say. "I got interested in weaving because of nut trees," I finally answered, deciding on the truth, though I knew it sounded strange. "They like to be cut back," I went on, "to keep producing nuts, and I wanted to learn more about the cutting and about how people traditionally used the cut branches and twigs." They smiled, and I noticed a few other women nodding. In most circles, this answer would have gotten me raised eyebrows and blank stares, but clearly I'd found good company. Even in my own mind, I was still puzzling through the connection I'd begun to see between nut tending and basketry. It had started on my visit to the Klamath, when I'd sat by the river chatting with Ron Reed's friend Kathy McCovey. We'd been talking about the importance of fire and burning to the tan oaks along the river, and she'd brought along a series of baskets made from hazelnut twigs to show me. One had a wide weave and a shape almost like a cradle, made for carrying a baby. Another was intricately woven into geometric designs and shaped as a cap to be worn during ceremonies. The final one was thin and round and open, made for winnowing away the little bitter, paper-like testa that stick to acorn nut meats. "This is what managing with fire gives you," McCovey, a fourth-generation Crook forester, had told me, holding up a bundle of long hazelnut stems that looked very similar to the willow twigs we were weaving today. Nice, straight sticks. Just as they do with oak, the Crook people burn their hazelnut patches, McCovey had explained, usually in the dry summer and early fall months. The next spring, the top-killed plants send up a smattering of small stems, ideal for small baskets and fine weaving. In year 2, the young hazel sticks grow longer, McCovey said, and can be used for medium-sized, more utilitarian baskets. For instance, those used to cook acorns, which cooks do by filling tightly woven baskets with water, acorn meal, and hot rocks. Finally, in year 3, the hazel stems become long and thick enough to create strong, weight-bearing baskets like the baby basket McCovey had shown me. The long, straight stems from recently burned hazel plants are coveted by weavers, who come from as far as 290-plus miles away to harvest them. By year 4 after a burn, the hazel stems begin to send out branches, rendering them unfit for weaving, and they move into the next phase of their life cycle, nut production. And I'll leave it there.
Oh, thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Your writing is so beautiful. I just feel like I'm there.
Yeah.
Thank you
Thank
for
you for
having
sharing
me.
your book. Yeah, thank you for being here. It's been great talking to you, and I'm so glad your book came our way. We needed to read it.
Yeah.
Thank
I feel
you.
All right, well, thanks for listening.
Till next time.
Till next
Thank
time.
you, everyone.
Thanks for joining us in the forest. If you felt a spark, share this episode and leave a review. It helps grow the mycelial network.
Follow our journey on Facebook and TikTok at Soulfire Forest. And until next time, stay rooted and radiant.